Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Monday, July 15th, 2013, halfway through the month now. Getting into the hot part of summer, and of course the corporate media is out there. Oh, it's really hot! It's really hot! It's summer, and we'll be talking more about that nonsense a little bit later on, where they're still out there trying to propagandize the world is getting warmer, and they're pushing that whole carbon-Nazi agenda. Obviously, the Zimmerman case is the top story. On Saturday, the jury down in Florida acquitted Zimmerman on both charges. Basically, the judge had given them instructions that they had to prove intent to cause harm before the confrontation in order to find Zimmerman guilty on either second-degree murder charges or manslaughter charges, and, of course, hue and cry and all the rest of that stuff going on here. The good news, of course, is that all of those violent riots that the corporate media was telling us was going to happen, and that flood of Twitter messages said, oh, we're going to go out there and burn Whitey, pretty much did not happen. Gigantic fizzle, which tells us the American people are waking up to these kinds of deceptions. And they just weren't going to be as much suckers as the peace activists were back in Disneyland during that staged riot here. Now, the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny's in the control room managing the Truth Warp Drive and ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And it was kind of interesting because as Sunday morning broke and Americans woke up wondering if America was on fire and tanks were in the streets, the corporate media was still out there trying to push the idea that some of these protests had been violent. There was a story that came out here in the Los Angeles Times, Zimmerman acquittal protest in Oakland turns violent. And then they say no arrests were made. Now, when do you have a violent protest where nobody actually gets arrested? And then they had to back off later on and say, well, the riots were really smaller than reported, and basically came out and said it was only, out of the 125 people who were protesting peacefully in Oakland, only a handful were engaging in acts of violence, that handful being the undercover FBI informants, agent provocateurs, and so forth. And what's really interesting is a photo that is rapidly becoming known as the Trash Can Man. This one photo just went around the world on all the corporate media, showing this guy just hurling a trash can into a window there in Oakland. And the photo just reeks of being public relations, because in the larger uncropped versions of the photo, the perpetrator is wearing black leather shoes. Not a fashion item you generally find on people who wear hoodies. Hoodies are kind of a fashion statement, usually go with running or track shoes. This guy had black leather shoes, screaming police officer. The trash can itself was brand new, shiny clean, right from the home store, hardware store. Didn't appear to be anything but some paper packing materials in it. And if you look at the actual trash cans that the city of Oakland does put on the streets, they're painted green. They have the recycling emblem on there. So this trash can had to be brought to the scene to stage this photo op for the Associated Press. And they're trying to basically sell this whole idea of race riots. It didn't take off. They didn't get traction. Congratulations to you, the American people, for having the wisdom to see through this 1950s, 1960s kind of attempt to stir up a crisis that the government can respond to. And it didn't work, and they're still out there trying to find some way to maximize this, at least as a distraction. We're going to be talking about this more when we come back from these words from our sponsors. I forgot to put up the volume here. Aloha, welcome back to the show here. And again, going back on this whole Zimmerman situation, and I don't want to get into whether or not Zimmerman was guilty or not. It was a horrible tragedy. My concern continues to be how government was attempting to fan this up for propaganda and political purposes. We know from Judicial Watch, the Department of Justice was actually using taxpayer dollars to encourage and support the anti-Zimmerman protests that tried to make this a nationwide major media story. And if you look at how many murders take place across America every single day, obviously picking out this one to promote, which they did, betrays an agenda. And they were trying to push this whole story last week about, oh, a Zimmerman acquittal will provoke riots. It'll be just like Rodney King. And it fizzled. And they were trying as hard as they could. Saturday night, some unknown party who created a brand new YouTube account to do this and then promptly deleted it, posted video from Vancouver, Canada's 2011 hockey riots and tried to pass it off as a Zimmerman riot taking place in Miami, which didn't last very long because you could see mountains in the background, and there really aren't any mountain ranges behind Miami. Plus, there was a mention of Harper in the audio. And so they were literally trying to sell this idea, riot, 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 go on out there and riot. And they had their agent provocateurs putting out all this stuff. And the reality is, looking at all the photos that have surfaced from the protests, they were peaceful. Interesting little collection from PolicyMike.com, 31 inspiring images from the Trayvon Martin protest in New York. These were peaceful marches. One of our listeners has been sending me photos they took at the Hollywood demonstration. That was peaceful. People just sitting around with their signs, talking, no violence, no violence, no violence. Interesting story over at 21stcenturywire.com. Trayvon, Twitter mobs demanding federal justice in new race hate retrial. And we need to go out there and remember that flood of Twitter messages, we're going to burn Whitey, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And the obvious disconnect between the volume of tweets calling for violence and the absence of violence in the streets, not counting the obvious agent provocateurs like Trash Can Man, strongly suggests that the tweets were part of a manufactured propaganda campaign. Remember, we know the U.S. federal government has spent your tax dollars to buy special software that allows any one of their paid propagandists to have 50 to 100 fake online identities into Twitter, Facebook, whatever, to go on out there and basically broadcast these messages trying to tell you what you should be thinking and how you should be reacting. And it's an epic, epic fail. It did not work. And again, my congratulations goes out to you, the American people, who are now smart enough and skeptical enough and aware enough that you're not going to get sucked into these things. Over the weekend, Alan Dershowitz was out there saying, you know, I want the Zimmerman prosecutors probed. They're just trying to keep this thing going because it's an excellent distraction. They want everybody paying attention to Zimmerman and its aftermath. You're being conditized. Because this government is in serious trouble over IRS Gate, DOJ Gate, Benghazi Gate, EPA Gate, Plum Gate, all of that stuff. The wars are not going well. The Middle East policy is collapsing. It's in a shambles. The economy is collapsing. They don't want you paying attention to that. They don't want you thinking about how the Wall Street money junkies and this federal government screwed up what used to be the greatest nation on earth. They're looking for somebody to blame, or they're looking for a distraction. Pay no attention to these money junkies behind the curtain, says the Wizard of Doze. You know, go over and look at the race riots. We're going to have blood for you. And then that didn't work out here. The NAACP is still out there screaming for the Obama administration to pursue civil rights charges against Zimmerman. Now, Eric Holder just had a press conference, which was notable for the thunderous applause of the audience, which means they got in an audience that was just going to cheer and scream no matter what he said. One quote leapt out at me. Eric Holder said, Trayvon's parents suffered a pain no parent should go through. Tell me, Mr. Holder, does that apply to the parents of all the children who've been killed in these U.S. wars of conquest? Why is it okay for those parents to go through the pain of losing a child? Because that's what you're implying, that Trayvon Martin's parents' pain is somehow special and exalted, and we should feel sorry for them. But we shouldn't pay attention to all those parents of American sons and daughters who've had to lose their child to make the money junkies richer. And they're still out there trying to promote racism. They're literally promoting racism, not as a policy, not as a philosophy, not as a belief, but just as a distraction. we have a racial crisis in this country. No, we don't. The photos from these protests of blacks and whites standing together, talking calmly about what happened, shows we don't really have a racial problem in this country. It's being manufactured to lure you away from the real problems of this country. Wall Street money junkies, federal government, the wars, the economy, corruption beyond belief. So Eric Holder did his little speech, and he got his thunderous applause, and all he really said was, we're continuing the investigation. In other words, he got up there and got his airtime on the corporate media saying absolutely nothing new, and saying it very well, and basking in the thunderous applause. But he didn't actually announce that anything is being done. We're continuing to study the situation, is what he said. And over the weekend, especially yesterday, the Department of Justice was already kind of hemming and hawing about whether or not they're going to try and take Zimmerman to court over civil rights violations. And it's a very dicey situation because the FBI's own investigation of Zimmerman failed to find any evidence of racial bias in his behavior or speech or anything prior to the encounter with Trayvon Martin. They didn't find any, and unless they can document a racial bias, civil rights, it's more frivolous than the case down in Florida. They're just trying to fan this up. Meanwhile, over at RINF.com, they were asking a very interesting story. If George Zimmerman were Monsanto, would anybody be saying, we have to seek justice for all those people killed by genetically modified food or made sick and crippled by genetically modified food? All these cancer-causing chemicals that are in the products they put out there. And the answer, of course, is no. This government knows better than to go up against the giant corporations. You won't get your campaign funding next season if you dare challenge the revealed orthodoxy of the giant biotech firms here. Meanwhile, Obama is out there banging the drum of the Zimmerman case to push his gun agenda. We must stem the tide of gun violence. Well, you could call off all these wars. A lot of gun violence going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Pakistan. That's a lot of gun violence going on over there. We should worry about stemming that. Because if you think about it, look at the example the government is setting for our young people. Got a problem? Shoot them. Somebody doesn't agree with you? Shoot them. Or drone strike them. It's kind of hard to be a young person in this country growing up with that kind of an object lesson every day on the corporate media. Oh, we don't like them? Kill them. That's the object lesson. By the way, have you noticed this weird, bizarre phenomenon in our government and corporate media? If there's a mass bombing, they blame the bomber. But if there's a mass shooting, they blame the gun. Doesn't that strike you as kind of a little bizarre? But Obama's still out there trying to push his gun grab agenda, and I imagine he's very frustrated right now because had there been mass riots across America in the wake of the Zimmerman acquittal, Obama would have had his excuse to say, oh, it's a national emergency, martial law, and just send out the squads to grab every gun that they were aware of out there in public, meaning every one of you who registered your gun in accordance to the law, your name is on one of those little lists where they'll come knock on your door, actually probably just kick it down because they're in a rush, start grabbing all of those things. Now that Zimmerman is over and done with, we're not going to flog that dead horse any longer, so it's back to Floodgate and all these other scandals that you really should be paying attention to because they do affect your life. Unless you are a close family friend of George Zimmerman or Trayvon Martin, this whole murder case didn't really affect your life, didn't change your life at all. It's condensation. They're trying to keep you looking the other way. Story is now breaking in a couple of different venues. It actually was broken by German media yesterday, how the U.S. government is using this vast spy network built with your tax dollars to target GMO activists and even independent scientists who might be conducting studies that would challenge the GMO industrial complex. Now, this has nothing to do with national security, has nothing to do with stopping crime, has nothing to do with defeating the terrorists. It's about protecting Monsanto's profitability. The U.S. government is spending your money to basically attack anybody who stands up and says, we're not convinced GMO food is safe. Is that an appropriate use of this already unconstitutional spying apparatus? Of course not. It's misappropriation of public funds for the government to use this NSA spy network, PRISM, all of these spy programs, to keep an eye on people who don't accept what the corporations are trying to feed us. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsor. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And the NSA is still trying to find some way that they can save face, save their reputation, save their budgeting, their funding. That's really what it comes down to. And so, not surprisingly today, the former director of the FBI came out trying to revive the specter of cyber terror and how it could wreak mass destruction on life and property. And basically saying all of this spying on your sexy phone calls from the war zone back to your family is justified in order to save the U.S. computer system from those evil cyber terrorists here. And obviously with the Trayvon Martin riots fizzling, an epic fail, just cratering, now they're back to waving cyber terror to scare us all. Now remember, we've talked before about the potential for a virtual 9/11. Where all the top financial experts say this system has to implode because it's all based on that Ponzi scheme, private central bank issuing the public currencies alone at interest. The debt is piling up, massive fraud, massive overprinting by the Federal Reserve to give to Wall Street so they can keep that stock market propped up. They can't keep it up forever. And these money junkies and the people inside government are not the sort of honorable people who would take responsibility for their crimes, corruption, stupidity, recklessness, and failings. They want somebody to blame. And so we have postulated that at the point where the system looks to be coming apart and they can't stop it anymore with market rigging and propaganda and fraud, that the U.S. government itself would crash all the computers of the Wall Street financial system and blame Iran for it, or Syria, or Russia, or China, or whoever it is they want us to fling our children at, onto the bayonets thereof. And so we need to be aware that that's a possibility. They're just going from plan A to plan B to plan C to plan D, and now they're down to plan Q and R, and not getting a lot of traction from that. But we know the NSA can't actually find real criminals or real terrorists. We've already proved that with our NSA challenge. We know that all this NSA spying has not put a dent into the flood of malware percolating into our computers every single day. They can't do it. This idea that this massive spying is going to somehow make our computer systems more secure is an absolute joke. If they can't find some little kid in a basement with a script to create worms, they're certainly not going to be able to do anything about real criminals with the resources to go out, create their own encryption and their own private means of communication. They're just not going to be able to do that. But they're still trying to sell you how, yes, we're violating the Constitution, and yes, we're getting off listening to your private sex phone calls with your spouse, but really, it's all necessary to protect you from the evil cyber terrorists, who are no more real than the evil Muslim terrorists. They're all phonies and frauds and fakes. It's all Emmanuel Goldstein. It's all made up to keep you scared and obedient, and obviously it's not working anymore. And yes, I know there are still some brain-dead people out there in society who say, oh, I don't care what the government does as long as I'm safe from terror. But if you think about it, isn't the NSA spying the biggest terror threat you face right now? People serving in our military in the war zones are now going to be terrorized into not being open and romantic and loving with their spouses back home out of fear they're being listened to. That's what they want you to be. They want you to be terrorized by the NSA, but think that the Muslims are the terrorists. It's a dichotomy that's becoming very, very obvious in our society. Meanwhile, interesting story coming out of Wisconsin, where environmental protesters at an exploratory mine in northern Wisconsin were met with armed and masked guards, paramilitary unit, protecting this mine from protesters. And it kicked up such a huge scandal that the armed security has now been removed. But it's another reminder of the militarization of the United States to the point where private corporations now have their own paramilitary units protecting their corporations from people who are concerned about environmental harm, toxification of the environment, including the drinking water, this whole fracking scandal. It's a very alarming trend here. British Prime Minister David Cameron is calling for an investigation into reports that an undercover police officer was part of a deliberate smear campaign against the family of a murdered black teenager, their version of the Trayvon Martin story over there. Now, let's talk about Snowden. And I think he's become a term of craft now. When the whistleblowing, no, pulling a Snowden, that's the new term. Somebody comes forward with more bad information about the government, they're pulling a Snowden. It's time to enshrine his name in the public lexicon. And by the way, obviously people like Edward Snowden and Russell Tice are the exception to the rule that pretty much everybody in the government is cool with what's going on around here. We're going to be talking about Snowden when we come back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha America, welcome back to the show here. Now, Glenn Greenwald over the weekend, actually on last Friday, was talking about Edward Snowden having what is called a dead man's switch. In other words, if for any reason, if Edward Snowden gets run over, hit and run accident, if a drone strike blows him to bloody bits, if his car simply explodes and crashes into a tree like Michael Hastings did, if lightning should strike Snowden dead, there is a body of data which will be automatically released to the world. And today, Glenn Greenwald clarified it to say that Snowden has the entire, what they're calling the blueprints of NSA surveillance, all of the various programs, all of the management, the entire blueprint for how this operation is set up. He is not going to release it while he's still alive, but that's the threat they're trying to present, because I'm sure by now Edward Snowden understands this government gets rid of people who are an embarrassment, whether it's those people, those victims down in Guantanamo who've been tortured, who can never be allowed to go out into public alive again because they'll show their scars to the media, whether it's Michael Hastings, whether it's any of the wet work that we've seen this government engaged in going all the way back to the death of Vincent Foster. And by the way, Saturday is the 20th anniversary of the murder of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster, which was the story that inadvertently launched me on this path of being an activist and a blogger and a truth teller. You know, I'd like to claim credit and say that, yes, because of my deep moral underpinnings and, you know, my devotion to truth and honesty that I deliberately embarked on this path. No, it actually was a bit of an accident. But here we are 20 years later. So Snowden obviously is very worried that there may be a contract out on him. And so he's basically set up and announced a dead man's switch. In other words, if you kill me, it'll be worse than if you let me stay alive. Now remember, Snowden is talking to the government of Russia about temporary asylum there while he works out where it is he wants to spend the rest of his life. And as part of a condition of that temporary asylum, while he's in Russia, Snowden is not going to release any more information. Now, what Glenn Greenwald already has in his possession to release to the world is another question entirely. But they're basically saying that Snowden has enough information to absolutely destroy the NSA, and that if anything untoward happens to Snowden, and by extension Greenwald, that information will be made public here. Story out of From the Trenches World Report, the latest polls continue to show that the constant propaganda on NSA spying and Snowden is not working. The American people see Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Russell Tice as heroes, and the American people do not, in fact, accept NSA spying on their personal lives when they have committed no crime at all. And you shouldn't. We already know this government will not preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution against all enemies, despite that oath they all take. If you want that Constitution and that Bill of Rights to be preserved, protected, and defended, you are going to have to do it. Because it's our country. It says so right at the top of the Constitution. We the people. It's our country, and it is our moral responsibility to hold that government to the rules under which we the people allow them to run this nation, ostensibly for the benefit of this nation and we the people. They're doing a lousy job at it, by the way. A sociology professor in Sweden has recommended Edward Snowden for the Nobel Peace Prize, and there's no question in my mind Snowden deserves it a heck of a lot more than Barack Obama did. And apparently this professor, Stefan Svalvors, who is himself a past winner of a Nobel Prize, which you have to be. Nobel Peace Prize winners have to be nominated by prior Nobel Peace Prize winners. And he's nominated, and I hope he gets it. We have seen these Nobel Peace Prizes go to people who simply do not deserve it. Al Gore, Barack Obama, Shimon Peres. And there are people we know working for peace who deserve that award, like Cindy Sheehan. I am appalled that she has not even been considered for that. And at this point, that Peace Prize is so tainted, I don't think anybody really cares anymore. Snowden, I don't think, is going to care whether he gets it or not, because it puts him in some very, very poor company. Now, we've talked a lot about the HBO program, The Newsroom. And I've now caught a couple of episodes, and it tends to blow hot and cold. But every once in a while, they come out with a gem. And apparently, almost a year ago, when the show was first coming out, about the same time period as that wonderful speech on America not being the greatest nation on earth, they had another segment, which is posted to the front of WhatReallyHappened.com, in which they talked about NSA surveillance, spying on everybody without warrants. And again, those of us paying attention to what this government is doing knew that this stuff has been going on all along. Most Americans weren't concerned. They figured, hey, if I'm not breaking the law, the NSA isn't spying on me. Wrong. Yes, they are. They're spying on you to get their rocks off, listening to your sexy talk with your wife, or husband, as the case may be. They're pillaging you for your business secrets. We know that was proven at the Seattle APEC. Insider trading, it's just open season on the American people and their private lives for which these operators profit, or at least have a lot of jollies off of it. This government cannot be trusted with your private data, and you should not trust them with your private data. If it's my secret chocolate chip cookie recipe, it's supposed to remain secret. And until somebody can demonstrate that those chocolate chip cookies are a threat to the national security, the NSA has no business looking into my recipe file. And yes, it's a trivial, benign example, but that's the whole point. The NSA is looking into everything. Complete violation of the Constitution. Now, I want to be I am very concerned, and so should you be, regarding a propaganda campaign to try and lull you back into a false sense of security and a false sense of privacy regarding all of this spying. Because we've heard Congress over the last couple of weeks say we're going to introduce all this legislation to basically fix the unconstitutional NSA spying. Well, Congress shouldn't have to. Congress should just simply enforce the Constitution and the laws that already exist. But Congress never enforces laws. DOJ never enforces laws. Every time one of these scandals blows up, oh, we have to have new laws, which are going to be no more observed and enforced than the previous laws. And careful analysis of the slew of bills being put forward to rein in the NSA shows that they won't actually do anything at all. They do not address the problem of domestic spying on law-abiding American citizens. They're just trying to hem and haw and reassure you that the problem is going to be solved. And of course it isn't. The NSA will go on spying on everything that you're doing until that entire spy infrastructure is ripped out, those data centers closed down, those large disk arrays sold off as surplus, and the entire system shut down, physically shut down. Anybody who believes the government when it says, yeah, we were spying on you now, but we promise we won't do it anymore, I have some of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction to sell you. Now, President Obama is still out there trying to justify his spying on every single American. And he's even going back to all previous presidents who said, really, keeping an eye on communication among the people was necessary to protect the security of the state, meaning the security of the government, going all the way back to Cromwell, who set up a government postal system in Britain for the express purpose of having the government able to read letters that were being delivered back and forth to spy on the people. Just like now they've set up the cloud to keep an eye on all your data. By the way, speaking of the cloud, the latest version of Skype for the iPad now goes through the cloud. You don't have an option. And it's buggy as all get out. Over the weekend, trying to Skype with friends and family, we could see each other, couldn't hear each other. We're being forced onto a system that exists to facilitate government surveillance, and it doesn't work. Probably because any decent computer programmers with a moral conscience are refusing to work for the NSA. And that means they're scraping the bottom of the barrel for the dregs of coders who can't get jobs anywhere else and are perfectly willing to say, yeah, I'll come in and write code for you to spy on the American people. Job is a job is a job. And I don't want to work for the fast food restaurants anymore here. Justice Department is issuing a new set of guidelines to make it more difficult for the federal government to seize journalists' email and phone records. Well, there's a funny thing about guidelines. They're not laws. They're guidelines. And it's optional whether anybody will follow them or not. This is part of a new propaganda campaign to say, you caught us spying on you, we promise we'll be good. Back when COINTELPRO was the scandal in the 1970s, the FBI came out and said, well, we're not going to do that stuff any longer. The Church Committee found out that, yeah, the FBI had gone right on doing these exact same COINTELPRO-style operations, despite assurances to the public that everything was better now. And as we saw over this last weekend with Trash Can Man and the flood of Twitter messages trying to fan up race riots, they're still playing those games. Now, we posted an article from prismbreak.org, which is a cool name, about how to evade or opt out of PRISM. And they're talking about using what's called the Tor browser, which routes your web requests through a gigantic network of servers to obfuscate who you really are from the remote site that you're accessing. And that's okay if it's the remote site that you're worried about, but I wish to underscore that the NSA is getting your browser traffic as it goes from your computer to your ISP before it goes into the Tor system. So it's of limited value against the NSA. On the other hand, if everybody starts using these privacy methods, it will increase the workload on the NSA to keep an eye on all of us. And, of course, if everybody is taking steps to preserve their privacy, NSA hasn't a clue where to look for real criminals and real terrorists. Actually, I have a hint for you, NSA people listening to this broadcast. Look for the people using codes you can't read. Those are the real criminals. And another little hint, try Wall Street. You want to find the biggest criminals in our society, go up to Wall Street. Second place, Washington, D.C. Leave our serving troops alone who are making hot phone calls to their spouses back home. They're not doing anything wrong. You don't need to listen to them. I know it's fun, and it's a lot cheaper for you than actually having a cable porn subscription, but they're not doing anything wrong. They're out there serving this country. They're wearing the uniform. They're going out and invading the countries the U.S. government say have to be invaded. Leave them alone. Now, over in Great Britain, as governments begin to finally grasp that they have lost control of the propaganda narrative because of the internet, because of the blogosphere, because of the independent media, now they're taking those draconian, tyrannical steps that advertise to the world, hey, we're really a dictatorship. Remember the slogan we have around here? Fastest way to bring down a dictatorship is to force them to act like one where everybody can see it, and it looks like Great Britain's getting ready to do just that. They're considering a plan in Whitehall that would order search engines to ignore certain websites, to never present them if somebody's searching for chocolate chip cookie recipes. And again, it's being sold as a necessity to deal with the epidemic of child porn, which, frankly, most of the really nasty porn that we saw back during the days of the Exxon Amendment turned out to be coming from government supporters. They were creating the crisis to use it as a device to exert control over the net. And I would not be surprised if most of the child porn is being created at government taxpayer expense. So they've got an excuse to go in and say, we must block these websites for the good of the children. And of course we know from the way they tend to mutate the meaning of terror or weapon of mass destruction, that once they start blocking the so-called child porn websites, it will be extended to sites that challenge the official government dogma on anything, because after all, they're aiding the enemy when they point out NSA spying, or the fact that GMO food might actually be bad for you. We've got to get that back under control. Like I said earlier in the show, the German media has blown the whistle that the U.S. government is using this massive spy apparatus to keep watch on GMO activists who are going out to, like that French study about how GMO corn and glyphosate are harmful. That's got nothing to do with crime or terror or even the wars. It's about protecting corporate profits. And definitely that is unconstitutional. For the government to spy on you without a warrant because you might say something Monsanto doesn't like. Now over at RINF.com, interesting story. The U.S. government has now repealed the earlier official ban on propagandizing the American people. Now, they've been propagandizing you all along, but it was technically illegal. We're not supposed to use propaganda on the American people. And that was part of a bluff. You know, they'd say, here's the news, here's what you want to believe in. Remember, we're not allowed to feed propaganda to you, so you should believe this. Arabs did 9/11. You know, carbon dioxide is making the world warmer. Well, because so many lawsuits have been filed every time it's been caught that the government is blatantly propagandizing the American people, the solution for that was repeal the law. Do you want to know the reason or the justification? The U.S. government is out there saying that Americans are thirsting for the official story, but can't find it because the government is not allowed to put their version of events out there on the internet or the news, which is complete, blatant nonsense. What they're doing is they're ramping up the propaganda machine into rock and roll, full tilt, afterburner overdrive, and they're just getting rid of the law. So basically they're admitting whatever the official story is, it is now legally admissible for the government to be propagandizing you. Like they're doing down in Baltimore. We were talking about the Baltimore School District is using up its precious educational and teacher resources in a course to teach children to ignore anybody who questions the official story of 9/11. How is that going to equip these children to get better, higher-paying jobs after school? And the answer is, it isn't. And it underscores the fact public education is not about education. It's about indoctrination. We're going to be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And Judicial Watch, who is already in the news because they uncovered the documents proving the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, was spending your tax dollars to encourage and support the protests against Zimmerman, trying to fan up this whole racial crisis as a distraction. They've now published their 10 most wanted corrupt politicians list for 2012, and yes, Hillary Clinton is on it. Just something to keep in mind as we head into 2016. She's already building her campaign war chest. She wants to be the first woman president of the United States of America, and I personally don't have a problem with a woman as President of the United States of America. I have a problem with that particular woman as President of the United States of America, both because of Vince Foster, cattle trades, the abuses of the Rose Law Firm, Whitewater, Castle Grand, Flowerwood, and Vince Foster. All right. Now, interesting little story. This is out of OpposingViews.com. There is a new law in Indiana that authorizes citizens in Indiana to use deadly force against public servants, including law enforcement officers who unlawfully enter their homes. And, of course, the police officers are saying, we can't do that. You know, if we kick down the wrong door and go in, we could be shot. Well, you know, what are we going to do about that? Well, the answer is you stop kicking down the wrong doors. That's the solution. You stop abusing the citizens. That's the solution. And by the way, this law will stand because the United States Supreme Court already ruled in a case called John Bad Elk versus the United States. American citizens have a right to resist unlawful violation of their civil rights by law enforcement, using any force necessary up to and including lethal force. That badge and that uniform does not make you immortal or immune or omnipotent. You are a police officer and you have certain authorities over the American people only as long as you play by the rules and limits. When you step out of those limits, you're just another American citizen committing a crime. And we have a right to protect ourselves from criminals even if they're wearing badges and uniforms. So kudos to Indiana. We're starting to shift the power back to the people, which is where it belongs. There's a huge public backlash against the police right now because of all these taser deaths and wrongful shootings. I mean, right now, you as an American citizen are 8 times more likely to die from a police error than from a terror attack. The corporate media is out there saying, terrorists, terrorists, be afraid, be afraid. Oh, the police, they were acting within, department policy and guidelines, and it's a tragedy that this person got shot, but really the police were just doing their job. No, they aren't. When the police make a mistake, that's not their job. And they should be held to account for it, and they should be liable criminally and civilly, and not dump the load onto the taxpayers every time they get caught violating the Constitution. We'll be right back after station identification. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the fallout from the Zimmerman case continues, and it's already reached reducto ad absurdum levels. Apparently over in South Carolina, their state Supreme Court has halted a murder trial because the defendant is claiming a stand-your-ground defense. And just to tell you how silly and absurd lawyers can get, the defendant here broke into a home to rob it. He encountered the homeowner inside the homeowner's home and shot and killed him. And he's now trying to claim that because he thought the homeowner was going to kill him for having broken into his home, that he had to shoot him first, and thereby qualifies under the stand-your-ground defense. Well, we can get rid of this one immediately. That intruder into the home wasn't standing on his ground. He was standing on the homeowner's ground. But it just shows you that, as a class, lawyers, they'll just come up with any absurdity to win the case. Lawyers destroy the idea of justice here. We're going to grab a phone call here. John in Virginia. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Just a couple of quick things. Yeah, I agree with you on the Zimmerman thing. It was an over-covered case. You know, nobody could tell what went on. Nobody was there. And all they were doing was fomenting, racial hatred and fanning the flames of race riots. And I saw on WhatReallyHappened.com those really good the photo analysis you did of the guy with a brand new garbage can thrown out the window.
Yeah, it was pretty obvious. And again, the actual trash bins that are on the streets of Oakland are painted green. They have a little lid for an ashtray on top. They're very heavy, by the way. And obvious brand new. Oh, where did that come from? He brought it with him. It's a prop. Took it off the prop truck.
Yeah. The polished shoes were a nice touch too. I like that. I appreciate you adding that to the touch. That he had those nice shined up boots or whatever he was wearing.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you noticed this, but I thought you'd get a kick out of it. Twitter surrenders data in French anti-Semitism litigation. Mm-hmm. Twitter says it settled ongoing litigation with an act. I know after listening to some of the things that you said, a lot of the, quote, anti-Semitism is done, they're all inside jobs. So this is, I would put this under the be careful what you ask or be careful what you wish for category, because Twitter is going to start, they claim they're going to release data to French authorities about anti-Semitic remarks, whatever that means. But if they really do that, they're going to really open up a can of worms, because half the stuff is all false flag.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of the really overtly blatant anti-Semitism is actually put out there by Israel, so they can say, oh, they're anti-Semites, and we have to control and shut them down. And it's all a fraud. I mean, they just caught another one of these settlers over there in the West Bank, spraying slaughtered Jews on his own car and slashing the tires, and then saying, see, it's race hate. They hate that. And, time and time again, we see all these frauds and hoaxes to try and sell that propaganda that the Israelis are poor, helpless victims, even as they're stealing other people's land, and how we have to support and give them weapons. And, Israel's got a huge weapons export business. If they have all these weapons they're building for sale, why are the American people being taxed to send more weapons to Israel? It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, and don't forget, I mean, do you remember after Katrina, it was, the one reporter who did a lot, he could never see 9/11 was an inside job, but he was a pretty brave reporter. And he,
okay, John, hang on. We got to take a break for commercials. Don't hang up. I want to come back to this after these. Hello, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to John in Virginia, I want to remind everybody of where I stand on this issue of anti-Semitism. Now, traditionally, classically, the definition of the word anti-Semite was somebody who hated Semitic people just because they were Semitic and for no other reason. Yes, it's racist. That's exactly what it is, and it is wrong. But over time, we have seen Israel and its supporters mutate the word anti-Semite to mean anybody who's critical of the policies of the Israeli government. And it's a it's a silly abuse of the term here. That's like trying to say that we don't have a right to criticize what the Nazis did because we're just being anti-German. But that's the position they take. So when you see somebody hurling the title anti-Semite, which we get a lot here, it's because we're criticizing the policies of a government. I'm not concerned with the Jewish people and their religion. Rivero is actually a Sephardic name. I would have been Jewish myself if it wasn't for the Inquisition back in the 1490s. My first wife was Jewish. But we do deservedly have a right to criticize the policies of the Israeli government, especially in light of the vast sums of money that is taken from us by our own government to fund Israel's actions. Anyway, John, would you please pick up where you left off?
Yes, sir. Mike, and I agree 100% with you. None of us are racist or anything. I mean, who's time for that?
That's true.
Ridiculous. We're almost living in a modern media Roman arena, where we're all pitted against each other, and we're all fight each other while these jackasses. I'm sorry, they're going to get us all. But anyway, getting back to the thing with the Israeli weapons. Following Katrina, Bill Moyer's journal had on Jeremy Scahill, who he did a really good job about examining Blackwater, which is the name of one of the things he did. And after Katrina, he mentions on that episode of Bill Moore's journal that the Israelis had automatic weapons, and they were guarding gated communities after they had confiscated the weapons of American citizens during that crisis. Mm-hmm. And, that is something that has always disturbed me. And the second point I'd like to make is that Rahm Emanuel supposedly I think he was a captain in the Israeli Defense Forces, and he went and he fought for Israel during the first Gulf conflict started by King George I here. Mm-hmm. So the Israeli influence that you speak of is absolutely there. It has nothing to do with you being an anti-anything. It has to do with being an American and recognizing that there are infiltrators embedded in our government who are absolutely abusing our system, taking our tax dollars, and using them against the wishes of we the people. And I admire all of the work you've done, Mike. You're a tireless patriot. And I don't like using the word patriot anymore, but you're a tireless fighter for liberty. And I admire you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words.
That's my 2 cents.
All right, well, thank you for that 2 cents. Actually, in these inflationary times, it's about 7.5 cents, but I do appreciate it. You're absolutely right, and I think the correct term is not infiltration, but subversion. Subversion from within. And again, when I was a kid in grade school, growing up in New Hampshire, we all saw those film strips and social studies about beware of communist subversion of the U.S. government. And it turns out subversion was in fact taking place even back then, but we were all being told to look in the wrong direction. We were looking at the commies and the Soviet Union, and meanwhile the subversion was coming in from a completely different direction here. Now this gets us on to a story. This is over at mycatbirdseat.com, asking a question, and it's been asked before and we've answered it before. Was 9/11 an inside job or a Mossad job? My answer is it was both. U.S. intelligence agencies and the Bush administration teamed up with Israel to carry off this gigantic false flag attack, the New Pearl Harbor, as it was described by the Project for the New American Century, to launch America on a century of unending war and conquest. And it's already falling apart. We're basically coming up on the 12th anniversary of 9/11, and the war policy in the Middle East is crumbling. Remember when Adolf Hitler set up his 1,000-year Reich, and it only lasted 12 years, and we're repeating the same thing right here in this country. Alrighty, so we're going to be talking, as we get into September, we'll be talking a lot more about 9/11, and already the government is trying to sort of pre-propagandize, you can trust the official story, don't listen to those alternative media people, like that course being taught in the Baltimore school district to teach kids, pay no attention to all those questions about World Trade Center 7 and thermite and the rest of it. You don't want to pay attention. You want to trust Big Daddy Government because Big Daddy Government loves you, so forth and so on. Interesting little story out of Refreshing News 99. There is a lawsuit being brought by the owners of the World Trade Center against the airlines whose airplanes were hijacked and flown into World Trade Center 1 and 2, but not Building 7, as we pointed out before. And U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein is considering whether the World Trade Center owners can sue the airlines for damages. And we're talking a huge chunk of cash, billions of dollars, for allowing their airlines to be hijacked and flown into the World Trade Towers. And my question about that is, why would the airlines be sued and asked to pay billions of dollars in damages? Because the airlines themselves did not manage security at the airports from which the supposed terrorists launched their attacks. Even the airport authority did not manage security at those airports used by the 9/11 hijackers. It was an Israeli-owned security company, ICTS, that was in charge of security at every single airport gate involved in 9/11. If anybody should be sued for allowing 9/11 to happen, it should be this company and not the airlines. I hope the judge will agree with that. But, lawyers and judges, they want to go where the money is. You don't sue people who can just go out of business and declare bankruptcy and you don't actually get a settlement. You sue the airlines. You sue the people with the money. And it's absurd to claim that the airlines bear any culpability or guilt for what happened. They're victims too. Now, over at the Daily Mail, remember, let me back up here a little tiny bit. Tom Stalcup, who's been a tireless and dedicated researcher into TWA 800, is coming out with a documentary this month talking about TWA 800. That's the 747 that exploded and crashed off the coast of Long Island in 1996. And a key feature of this documentary are these 3 former official investigators, part of the official investigation into TWA 800, and they've now gone Snowden and said they were ordered by the U.S. government to lie to the American people about what happened. They were ordered by the FBI to ignore important pieces of forensic evidence recovered with the wreckage. And so officialdom is already out there trying to spin the story because Tom Stalcup does not say where the explosion came from that took the plane down. He just makes the case it was a missile, which over 700 people saw. So now over here in the British media, the Daily Mail, they had a headline story, how 9/11 mastermind revealed to Mafia Capo an Al-Qaeda plot to bring down airliner just weeks before TWA 800 and the FBI were told about it. And the story is, this is a classic limited hangout. You know, little scandal. The FBI knew in advance of the Al-Qaeda plot to bring down the commercial airliner. Just like we know the FBI knew about the Japanese plan to invade Pearl Harbor ahead of time. Okay? And they're trying to resell terrorism. Oh, no, please don't blame the U.S. Navy. We never make mistakes like that, which, of course, they do. The USS Vincent accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger airliner. And this was an updated version of the same botched system they were testing off the coast of Long Island. So the latest pile of official USDA choice bovine excrement is that Al-Qaeda, whoever that really is, sailed a tiny boat into the middle of an ongoing U.S. Navy live-fire test of Aegis CEC, fired off a missile that hundreds of eyewitnesses saw strike TWA 800, and which is incidentally the same kind of missile Aegis CEC is supposed to detect and intercept. Then these terrorists, these Al-Qaeda terrorists, sailed right back out of this ongoing U.S. Navy exercise without so much as a single U.S. ship detecting them or giving chase. And the U.S. government, which has never hesitated to blame Al-Qaeda for everything from 9/11 to receding hairlines, decided to keep this one incident top secret until right this moment, just when these three NTSB whistleblowers come forward to say they were ordered to lie about exploding center fuel tanks. So apparently the motto of the U.S. government continues to be, if at first you don't succeed, lie, lie again. Let's see, latest Gallup poll shows that the United States Congress is less popular with the American people than North Korea, which I'm sure is cause for celebration among the North Koreans. They're going to be cracking open those kimchi pots and having a real party. But I mean, in terms of having the trust and support of the American people, the federal government, they don't have it anymore. They don't have it. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're getting a bit of an update on the Snowden saga. And the latest report is that Edward Snowden will leave Russia at the earliest possible opportunity. The big trick being how to get from Russia to wherever he's going to seek asylum without being shot down by the United States Air Force. And I think one of the reasons why we get all these conflicting stories about what's going on is intentional on Snowden's part in order to basically keep the U.S. government and the NSA running around in circles trying to figure out what he's going to do. And after that huge embarrassment with the president of Bolivia, the United States needs to be very, very careful they don't repeat that disaster ever again. The repercussions of that are still being felt all over South America. Major, major foreign policy disaster here. Now, interesting story, and again, as I mentioned earlier in the show, Obama is trying to use the Trayvon Martin case to support his gun control agenda. Remember, when there's a mass bombing, they blame the bomber. When there's a mass shooting, they blame the guns. And apparently, the Brady Center is now suing the Georgia town, Nelson, Georgia, who passed an ordinance requiring households to own a firearm. And they are not the first town to do so. And every town that has passed an ordinance requiring every home to have a gun has seen crime drop. And now the Brady Center is trying to find a way to sue this town to force them to rescind this ordinance so the town can be returned to being a risk-free environment for criminals to operate in. So they're back out there, they're pushing the gun grab. I think everybody was betting that they were going to get these race riots and use them to justify a gun grab, and it didn't happen. It's a reminder, the Obama administration has lost the propaganda narrative. They're totally reactive right now. Over in Syria, 2 car bombs exploded near the Turkish border with Syria, killing 40 people. So they're still trying to fan that up and build a case for why we, the American children, should be sent to Syria to do whatever it is they're trying to do over there. Now, Russia Today is reporting that the last Israeli strike on Syria, back on July 5th, was launched from an airfield in Turkey. Now, if this can be confirmed, this is going to be a major blow for Erdogan, because a big part of the protests going on in Turkey right now is over Turkey's unquestioning support for the U.S. and Israeli agenda in Syria. And so, if Russia Today is correct, and if it can be documented that Israel was using Turkish airfields to launch acts of war against Syria, that's going to severely increase the anger of the Turkish people, who are tired of having a government that just refuses to listen to their concerns about all this death and violence, not unlike we have here in the United States of America. Apparently, the Syrian government forces have found yet another cache of chemical weapons. These were chemical weapon artillery shells that appeared to be intended to use on Damascus, to shell Damascus with chemical weapons, kill off a lot of Syrian people, and say, oh, the evil Assad did it. And if you don't believe us, you're being an anti-Semite. Over at Gilad Atzmon's website, I mentioned this a little earlier in the show, Haaretz reported there are more than 6,800 arms exporters working in Israel. 6,800 in a country half the size of New Jersey. If Israel has such a healthy weapons industry, and they're exporting and selling them all over the world, why are American taxpayers still forced to give Israel weapons, most of which are probably being reverse engineered and then resold as part of their healthy arms export business? If Israel really needed weapons to defend themselves against the evil Arabs, they wouldn't be selling them to other countries. Amazing, amazing situation over there. Apparently, Israel had another whoopsie with one of their drones. They were using a Hermes 450 drone. It's one of Israel's top drones for surveillance, and apparently they were caught flying it over the Sinai. And it's now the headline says Israeli regime shoots down own drone. That's not exactly what happened. The drone suffered a mechanical failure. The engine quit working. And when Israel realized they couldn't get it back to Israeli territory, they intentionally crashed it to reduce the amount of intelligence information that could be gathered from recovering the wreckage. And then apparently Israeli forces went into the Sinai and recovered the wreckage. But it's another whoopsie. The significant story here is that Israel is conducting this surveillance over the Sinai, which reinforces the idea that Israel may be considering retaking the Sinai. We'll be Aloha, right America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to the phones, I listened to that song, read the Declaration, where it says the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, pursuit of happiness was shoved in there because the original document said right to property, and that sort of offended the money junkies that we were already being infested with back then. But looking at that first one, the right to life, and I realize we're seeing all this corporate privatization of the essentials of life. And that comment made by the CEO of Nestle, that humans don't have a natural right to water. Well, if water is essential to life, and if the Declaration of Independence says we have an inalienable right to life, that implies we have an inalienable right to all the necessities of life, including food and water. And I think that's what the Founding Fathers were saying, is that the American people have an inherent right to have what they need to continue their lives. Food, water, basic shelter. And so this CEO of Nestle, well, he's another classic money junkie here. We're going to go to the phones. George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike?
Doing fine.
I know some Patriot broadcasters sort of like blowing up the riot thing, and Mike, I didn't really see no really pending riots, just a few little flashes out west. But, you know, actually talking to some colored black people that I work with on the job, you know, the thing is, the younger people, they don't really like the old guard or the black leadership that's sort of like, get their people kept their people poor for generations and keeping them bitter and all that stuff. And they're starting to realize that the American people are perfectly capable of resolving, having good racial relations without the U.S. government's help.
Well, you know, what it is, these people like Al Sharpton and everybody else, they've made their careers and their fortunes, you know, fighting racism, and obviously they have to keep the illusion of racism out there in order to keep donations flowing in. It's just like Israel has to keep claiming there's anti-Semitism, or the ADL has to claim there's anti-Semitism, or people aren't going to write them checks any longer. And we see that same mechanism in all of these so-called social leaders, leaders of movements for justice and whatever. They only survive as long as they can continue to promote the idea that there is a problem that they are, have to be funded to solve. Global warming people doing the same thing. Global warming, give me money. And there's a lot of people who are now very critical of Al Sharpton's very obvious attempt to use the Zimmerman case to promote the idea that there's a major racial crisis in the American people, and there just isn't. Now, maybe I'm a little biased because here on Hawaii, everybody is of all these different races just all blended together. There are no black people or white people. It's all just varying shades of tan, brown, and gold. And, but again, for those who profit from the impression of racial discord, they have to put it out there and make it happen. Just like, back in the 1930s where, the American Nazi Party was out there, screaming and yelling, and the ADL was saying, see, there are Nazis, please donate money so we can... And it turned out this American Nazi Party were actually working for them and funded by them. That's called the Hegelian dialectic. Create a crisis out of thin air and then offer to sell everybody the solution. And we're seeing the same thing with these so-called civil rights leaders who are out there pushing the agenda of white and black separatism and saying, it's a danger, it's a threat, there's still all this injustice. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were so happy to get rid of Dr. Martin Luther King, because he was trying to bring everybody together in one united American people. And, of course, that is a major threat to the federal government's power. They need to keep us separated and divided. That was the whole logic behind that Black Panther coloring book. And, frankly, looking at what is coming out of this so-called new Black Panther Party, who, by the way, also did not show up to do any writing, I think they're another manufactured covert group to go on out there and sell you the idea that there's racial tension in this country and pay no attention to what the government is doing because you've got to be viewing your next-door neighbor with suspicion. And it's junk. And the absence of any riots this last weekend, I think, underscores that there, too, the propagandists have lost the narrative, and the American people are seeing through all these frauds.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. They lost the narrative, and it's because Obama's been caught with this Justice Department from start to finish in this saga. Influencing a judge, having the paid-for protests with the rent mobs, these fake dummy accounts calling for riots on Twitter. I know that, it's just that they lost the narrative. And the same thing, Obama talking about bringing George Zimmerman back in for gun violence. I think that's going to fall flat, too.
Zimmerman was within compliance with the laws in effect. Apparently, he's getting his gun back. The police are returning his gun to him following his acquittal. And, another way that we know this was all being stage managed, over the weekend I got one of the pictures of the peaceful protests, and all the signs were exactly the same, pre-printed, ready to go even before Zimmerman's verdict was announced. They had all these signs made up to simply take out of the back of a truck or a van and hand to people and say, stand around here and be photographed. And when you see a crowd and they're all holding the same printed signs, same color stock, same typeface, everything, it's a stage-managed incident. Real public protests, you see all these individually made signs. Some of them are very creative and humorous. And that's how you know it's a genuine expression of popular concern. But when you have a photographed crowd and they're all holding the same printed signs from the same provider, that is a stage-managed incident.
Well, those stage protesters, you got to remember, I used to say those stage protests probably get a free sack lunch, compliments of Monsanto. Thank you, Mike.
Yes, and, chow down there, guys. Useful idiots here. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you for the call. Over in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is once again screaming about Iran is ready to cross the red line to nuclear weapons. He's not even saying they have nuclear weapons or building nuclear weapons. He's back there saying, there's a red line. We have decided for the rest of the world. This is where the red line is, and Iran is getting ready to cross it, blah, 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 blah. And he's screaming about how, you know, in the midst of all the turmoil in Syria and Egypt and Turkey and Trayvon Martin, the world has forgotten about the danger that Iran presents, and he's out there screaming about the whole thing. But, you know, Israel's been screaming that Iran is on the verge of a nuclear weapon since 1985. Israel wants Iran smashed, broken into little tiny helpless sub-fragments that Israel can rule covertly or overtly or indirectly. Israel wants Iran smashed. They always have. They just want your children to do it for them, because those Israeli children are really way too precious to risk in a war of conquest against Iran. So now Netanyahu is saying, if the rest of the world won't deal with Iran, we, Israel, will have to do it ourselves. Okay, my response is go ahead. Israel, if you really feel that you need to destroy Iran, just help yourself. Here's your rifle, Benny. Here's your parachute. Watch your head climbing into that transport plane, and we'll call Iran and tell them you are on your way to kick their butt all by yourself. But after that whopper about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, much of which came from Israel, we're going to sit this one out. Because Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. Nobody has found any evidence. There's a lot of rumor and innuendo. No hard evidence of wrongdoing. Iran is playing by the rules of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they signed and the U.S. signed. They allow the inspections. Nobody's found any evidence of weaponization. Israel, which has nuclear weapons, it's now an open secret. The Knesset was openly talking about Israel's nuclear arsenal in their most recent session. So now it's out there. Israel is a nuclear power, but they have not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They continue to refuse demands by the United Nations and the United States to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They will not allow inspections. And they're the ones out there screaming, Iran, Iran, Iran. Hurt them, hurt them. Iran has not launched a war of aggression in over 200 years. That's a record that cannot be matched by either the United States or Israel, who cannot seem to go for 6 months without starting another conflict somewhere. So Netanyahu is out there trying to get that one going again. I think the world is basically, we're tuning him out. We've heard it before. Back to the 1980s, we've been hearing about Iran's nuclear threat. It hasn't happened. Israel's the nuclear threat. They got caught trying to sell a clandestine nuclear weapon to the former South African government. The very activity the Non-Proliferation Treaty is supposed to prevent. Israel's not playing by the rules, but they want you to think that Iran are the bad people, and you should go kill them for Israel. Alrighty, let's switch over here to the economy. Interesting story over at Ex Republic TV. Apparently, Chris Matthews got into an on-air debate with Jan Helfeld over the morality of taxation. Not even getting into its legality and the issues about whether the 16th Amendment was actually ratified or not. And apparently Jan Helfeld basically cleaned Chris Matthews' clock on that whole situation. Remember, when this nation was started, an income tax on the people was unconstitutional. Not just illegal, unconstitutional. There actually were earlier attempts to create a personal income tax sponsored by the private central banks. First Bank of the United States tried it. Second Bank of the United States tried it in order to collateralize government borrowing with the slave labor of the American people. And it was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Clear violation of the Constitution. So they came up with that 16th Amendment to say, oh, now it's legal and constitutional, except that nobody can actually prove that amendment was actually ratified. And in our post-Saddam's weapons of mass destruction culture, most Americans are ready to accept it. Yes, back then, 100 years ago, the United States government lied to us all to claim the personal income tax was actually legal. Over at Investment Watch blog, more comments about why a recession in the U.S. economy is now inevitable within the next 12 months. I think it'll hit before the end of the year. Another story coming out of mybudget360.com called Part-Time Nation. What does it say about the United States economy when the majority of our society are working only part-time jobs? Remember that last jobs report that came out where they said the total number of jobs went up, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. And what they didn't tell you was that the economy lost almost 250,000 full-time jobs, those were replaced by 2 and 3 part-time jobs. So while the numbers went up, it didn't actually improve the employment situation in this country. Only 47% of Americans have a full-time job right now. And this trend to replace full-time workers with part-time workers is in response to evade the requirements of Obamacare. Plus, not included on those job numbers is the growing trend of internships, which is basically, unpaid slavery. If you want to go to work for one of these corporations, they'll say, well, here's an internship where you will work for us and do what we tell you and let us abuse you for 6 months, and at the end of the time, if you've proven yourself enough of a slave, we'll give you an actual paying gig. All right, we're going to take another phone call here. Peter in Los Angeles. Aloha. Peter, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Michael. I just wanted to remind everybody out there, when talking about Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, how their livelihood, and if you look back over the last 5 years since Obama's been in office, has been severely curtailed, because it's apparent, that if every single black person voted for Obama, which virtually they did, and they wouldn't have been elected without white people. It's just without enough white people thinking that this guy is good enough to be president, it wouldn't have happened. Well, if you remember back in the 2008 election, you barely, he got damned by faint praise by the civil rights, quote, establishment like Sharpton, especially Jackson, where they say he's really not one of us. He's really not a black guy. He's really kind of a white guy in a black package. That's kind of what they said. It's as far as they could go, of course, without, because they
I don't care what package he comes in, he's doing a lousy job for the American people. I think we can all agree on that.
Absolutely. But at any rate, and now he's sort of relevant, and now Obama, because of all the myriad of mismanagement and corruption and really tyrannical stuff that he's doing, and all these gates that we're talking about, he has to fall back on the same constituency that got him is his core constituency, who will never turn their back on him simply because he is black.
Well, and that core constituency is shrinking. I mean, even in the last election, it was reported that he had less blind support from the black population, because the black people are smart enough to realize it isn't about the color of the skin of the president or the gender. It's the performance of that person. And what's really amazing, for all the caterwauling about how Obama's election was showing the empowerment of black politicians in America, his job performance is going to make it harder for other black candidates in the foreseeable future. Anytime a black person stands up and says, I'm going to run for president, they'll say, oh, not another Obama. And they should be doing the same thing for white candidates too. Oh, not another Bush. But unfortunately, because it was so, the campaign was so grounded in the issue of race and skin color, it's going to backflash. And there are probably some black people out there who'd make much better presidents who are just not going to get the chance, because they're going to inherit this legacy of the Obama administration. Unfairly, but it's going to happen.
Assuming there are any more elections, under this guy, I think you underestimate just how blind and how visceral the support is for Obama. Simply,
I disagree. The absence of riots this last weekend tells us that this idea that the black population can be encouraged to do X, Y, Z, riot, vote a candidate, it isn't there anymore. And
but Obama's banking on it. And
that's his mistake.
Maybe less than it has been.
Maybe he doubled up on his SSRIs, but that's his mistake. He can't bank on that. Now, he's not running for election any longer, But if he thinks the black population are going to be of sufficient force to protect him against litigation and possible impeachment, that's a really serious mistake. He's got to be rethinking his racially profiled support after last weekend, because he didn't get those riots he wanted.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
But I believe that that's why he is doing that, because he believes he needs them to prevent litigation.
Well, it just underscores how seriously disconnected with reality he and his administration have become. Got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, Peter. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. And that safari sounds like a really fun trip. Of course, these days I do my hunting with a telephoto lens, because if I can get close enough to take the picture, I'm close enough to make the kill. And I know a lot of people are very concerned about hunting, but I think we should be far more concerned about these wars where our government is encouraging our kids to go hunt other human beings. So let's keep these things in perspective. Now, back to the economy. Very interesting story that is coming out now. The U.S. government is considering a $5 billion penalty against the Standard & Poor's ratings service for giving AAA ratings to those mortgage-backed securities in 2008, which clearly were not deserving of AAA ratings. And because they had AAA ratings, pension funds were able to invest in those securities under law, and as a result, the pensions got defunded when the whole thing fell apart. Now, Standard & Poor's has made a motion to the court to dismiss this lawsuit, saying that reasonable investors understand that S&P's assurances of independent analysis of securities are just marketing, and that its ratings should be treated as free speech, not financial statements. And this is continuing something that we heard in the congressional hearings looking into the meltdown of the mortgage-backed security fraud, where Congress said, how could you rating agencies give these bundles AAA ratings when they were full of multiple copies of the same mortgage, they were full of mortgages that were already in default and foreclosure? And their excuse was, well, it's really just our opinion, you know, and if you take our opinion, that's really your own fault. And so basically we have these rating agencies on Wall Street admitting their claims of independence from the Wall Street investment firms are just marketing. They're acknowledging they're tied in, because the investment houses will hire these ratings firms to give their ratings give their offerings AAA ratings so that they can go out and sell them. It's all advertising and promotion. And S&P's excuse said the people who know what's going on understand it's just advertising and marketing, and it's not a real evaluation of the quality of the investment. Meanwhile, of course, the one Wall Street rating agency, Egan-Jones, that was truly independent of the Wall Street investment firms has now been shut down by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so really it's all rigged. Even S&P is admitting, we're not independent, that's just our advertising. You know, we're here to make the investment bundles look good so we can get the suckers in there buying them. And that's their argument in court about why they should not be fined billions of dollars for giving AAA ratings to those mortgage-backed security bundles that wrecked the place back in 2008. You know, we're engaging in free speech when we're telling people to go ahead and invest their money here. Wow, just amazing. All right, we're going to take a break for station identification. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Dan is now in the control room, and we will be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And turning to China, we're getting this interesting story. It was published in mninews.marketnews.com. China government advisor says economy in crisis as debt costs spiral. And they're quoting Xia Bin, who's an economist with the State Council Development Research Center, saying that all this talk about China growing at 7% or 7.5% is completely pointless because the economy is already in a crisis. It's crippled by accumulating debt. See, they have the same kind of brain-dead system over there we have here in the United States of America. And although monetary printing, which we call here in America quantitative easing, has kept the worst of the crisis at bay, this economist, this government advisor, is saying there's going to be a major adjustment. And he's suggesting they have to just let the bubble burst. They have to write off the losses in order to head off a bigger crisis. And this is something that the U.S. government should have done following 2008. Same thing that Iceland did. Throw the crooked bankers in jail, kick out the government, help them do it, write off all the debt created through fraud and manipulation, and restart the economy. And Iceland's economy is doing very well. But everything the federal government of the United States of America has done since that crisis was 180 degrees out of phase with what would have worked to restore the economy. Instead of taking trillions of dollars from the American people to give to the banks to loan back to the American people at interest, they should have taken trillions from Wall Street, who, after all, created this mess, and given it to the American people. And if they had done that, the American people wouldn't have missed a mortgage payment. There wouldn't be a real estate and mortgage crisis. They would have stayed current on their credit cards. There wouldn't be a credit crisis. They would have bought brand new American automobiles. There wouldn't have been needed the automotive bailouts. We would have gone down to the shopping malls and bought all kinds of goods and services. There wouldn't be a retail crisis or an American manufacturing crisis. Everything this government did in order to serve the money junkies made the problem worse. We're going to grab a phone call here. Fred in Michigan. Aloha, Fred. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, man. Well, two monumental topics here. This one presently, I couldn't agree more. Mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, and then the good old infamous credit default swap, since it's all Wall Street casino gambling, and their ratings agencies, if I'm not mistaken, are owned by these Wall Street gangster banksters.
Well, they're partly owned, but they're also paid by them. And that's why, of course, S&P is now out there saying, it's just our free speech opinion, and, the insiders know that we're not really independent. And it's absurd. But it just indicates the entire system is corrupted and fraudulent.
Well, why can't we pursue a transaction tax on all of their... Most of it is computerized electronic transactions.
Oh, that would absolutely shut down all this manipulation from the high-frequency trading, and the Wall Street, bigwigs are fighting that transaction tax tooth and nail. They don't want to be taxed. They want you to be taxed on everything that you're doing.
Herman Cain had it right in the sense that he left out deliberately the 9% transaction tax. That's what we need to shoot for. That's what I'm really focused on.
Well, anybody who's pushing that transaction tax is immediately going to be defunded in terms of campaign donations from Wall Street, and that's why nobody will touch it. Fred, sorry, got to let you go. Got a commercial break. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And it should be obvious to even the most casual observer that U.S. foreign policy, especially in regards to the Middle East, is just falling apart at the seams. And if you go back to All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, we talked a lot about the petrodollar scam that the U.S. government instituted following Richard Nixon's ending of gold convertibility, which basically kneecapped Bretton Woods. And so the goal was to go out and encourage the world's oil-producing nations to sell their oil only for U.S. dollars, so the U.S. could profit off of other people's oil. And much of the current militarist campaign we're seeing involves going into countries that dared sell their oil for currencies other than the dollar. Invade them or regime change them so that their oil is once again only for sale for U.S. dollars. But that petrodollar scam only works if every oil-producing region on Earth is agreeing to sell their oil only for U.S. dollars, and many of them are not. And now the situation just got a little more complex because Russia has just announced that they have discovered, or to be more accurate, declassified the existence of vast reserves of oil and gas on their territory. 17 billion tons of coal, 48 billion cubic meters of gas. And Russia is seeking investment in the extraction and production of hydrocarbons, and Russia is not going to sell them for the U.S. dollar. And now we're getting word out of Australia that they have discovered a massive, massive oil and gas formation that contains more oil than all of the oil still in Iran, Iraq, Canada, or Venezuela. And Australia is probably not going to sell that only for the U.S. dollar. They already have a direct currency exchange with China. Australian dollars for gold yuan, back and forth. So what is the U.S. going to do now? Declare war on Australia to make sure that oil is only sold for the U.S. dollar? Are they going to declare war on Russia? We've seen the propaganda. Russia got onto the special high-interest targets list when they took control of their central bank to run the public currency as a public utility instead of a private money-making venture for the money junkies. India is buying Iran's oil for rupees. What are we going to do? Invade, well, we already know they want to invade Iran. What are they going to do? Invade India? Meanwhile, there was a very alarming story uncovered by the U.S. corporate media. This came out of scmp.com. And it talks about the yuan gaining international acceptance as the world's reserve and trade currency. And they're nicknaming it the redback. Red as in communist China, which is really not all that communist anymore. And now we're seeing more and more economists and academics saying that, yeah, this is the coming thing. The dollar is clearly in decline, despite all the threat of war to keep it as the world's global currency. But it's poised for a fall, and more they're looking at China and its gold-backed yuan as the global currency of choice, which is why we're hearing all the nasty China bashing going on and trying to get war going with China. But, I mean, let's be very honest here. The U.S. can't even handle the wars it's got. They're falling apart. The campaign in Syria, we're almost 3 years into an attempt at a covert overthrow. And not only are the hired mercenaries now fighting amongst themselves and Assad retaking his country, but those neighboring countries that were going to be used as the jumping off points for an actual invasion, they're starting to fall into chaos. Egypt, Turkey, they're trying to regroup and use Jordan as the staging point for an invasion of Syria. That's not working out too well. It's falling apart. The whole thing's falling apart. And if they can't handle those small military engagements, do you really think the United States is able to take on Russia and or China in a conventional war and prevail? And the answer obviously is no. And that means if this war agenda proceeds any further into direct conflict with Russia and China, the U.S. will have to resort to its nuclear weapons. And remember, the United States remains the only nation on Earth to actually use nuclear weapons of mass destruction on the civilians of another country. For all the talk about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which we now know didn't exist, for all Netanyahu screaming about Iran is getting ready to do a nuclear bomb, the only nation that has actually used nuclear weapons of mass destruction on the civilians of another country is the United States of America. They ended World War II using nuclear weapons. They will escalate World War III using nuclear weapons. They can't do otherwise. The United States lacks the 3 M's, the men, the manufacturing, and the money to engage in and prevail in a conventional ground war against Russia and or China. And that's why this continued policy along this direction of the dollarification of the entire world is going to end in disaster. Cannot help but end in disaster. Of course, to the bankers who are loaning money to support these wars, they don't care. The history of banker-inspired war is they don't care which side wins or loses. They have no loyalty to the nations in which they're sitting. They have loyalty only to their own wallets. And bankers love war. They love sending millions of your children to die because it puts gold into their pockets. And they don't care which side wins or loses because both sides go into debt to fight the war. Both sides go deeper into debt to recover and rebuild after the war. And when this horrible disaster, these world wars are all over, Ordinary people have pretty much what they had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger. And they're back in debt to the central bankers for another 100 years. That's the scam. And you need to remember something. Before the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Private central banking and world war are handmaidens to disaster. Now, over at the Vatican, the banking scandals continue to pile up over there. Apparently, senior Vatican official Monsignor Nunzio Scarano, whose nickname is Don 500 because his favorite unit of currency is the 500 lira note. Apparently, he's been caught with secret bank accounts he wasn't supposed to have, 2 of which were used to smuggle 20 million euros into Italy from Switzerland. He was caught laundering money to buy himself a 1.7 million euro luxury flat in Salerno. And of course, 2 years ago, there was the affair of Evaristo Don Bancomat Biasini, an official working for the Congregation of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood, which is another one of these obfuscated names they put on their financial centers, who was accused of shady financial dealings in construction. Remember, one of the stories that came out of the whole child molestation scandal was the revelation that the Vatican Bank is not the only financial operation run by the Vatican. There's a second financial network hidden from the public, which is where the real wealth of the church is concentrated, so the lawyers can't find it in all these lawsuits about molested little tiny kiddies here. Alrighty, let's see. Going to grab another phone call here. Kerry in Florida. Aloha, Kerry. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. The nuclear war is on my mind. You think when you indicated that you think that the U.S. would strike first, and my question or point or whatever is, I think there's some sane people left in the military. Excuse me. Although many have been leaving, and I can't fathom it, Michael. How do you see this process? How do you see this coming about? I don't understand.
Do you remember a movie called Crimson Tide? Denzel Washington starred in it about a disagreement on a nuclear ballistic missile submarine where they almost started a nuclear war, and because of the actions of the crew, they were able to prevent it from happening. And it's a really interesting...
Absolutely.
Okay. And if you remember, in the end titles of that movie, they announced that control over the launching of the nuclear weapons of the United States was now, because of computerized control, solely in the hands of National Command Authority, meaning the President and, under the two-man rule, one other individual. If they type in their little code numbers and turn the key, the weapons will launch, and the actual service people out there on those platforms no longer have control over it. Now, for the SSBNs, I understand there's a huge amount of autonomy there, but the reality is, certainly in terms of the ground-based missiles and deploying various other automated weapons like nuclear-tipped cruise missiles and drones, the individual soldiers out there on the field really don't have the authority to call it off, because it was understood, even all the way back to when they made the movie War Games, that people in the field might not be able to bring themselves to turn that little key and commit mass murder on such a scale. And so the reality is that if the U.S. decides they're going to go to nuclear war, they're probably going to do it using systems where once they say do it, it'll be just carried out automatically without any other human intervention. I would expect that what will likely happen is the U.S. will use covert nuclear weapons. They're not going to get on the news and say, we're going to nuke this place or that place. We know that some of the so-called bunker busters developed to get at Iran's underground nuclear fuel rod processing plant are themselves nuclear as well. So the U.S. could send one of those in, blow it up, and then say the radiation proves they were building bombs down there. And I think we could definitely see a covert nuclear war that isn't understood to be what it is until we're way past that and the big city busters start getting used. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And if you're watching the corporate media, they're going on and on about the heat wave that's striking the northeast of the United States. Oh, my goodness, the temperatures are going to be in the 90s for the next 4 to 5 days. Well, I grew up in that part of the country long time ago. And temperatures in the 90s was what you got in July, the middle of summer. They're trying to still get out there, oh, it's warmer, it's warmer, it's warmer. And you have probably heard for the last few years running, oh, this was the hottest summer on record. This was the hottest, they were saying it a week ago, hottest summer on record, and they are lying to you. Because if you go back and look at the actual raw data, and don't rely on the Goracle, you will find out that we are still nowhere near as warm as the summer of 1936. But they're still out there trying to convince you this is the hottest summer ever, where the world is warming, you've got to pay a carbon tax, you've got to live a reduced lifestyle here to save planet Earth. And if you ever notice the people out there screaming that we have to live simpler lifestyles are living in mansions and private jets and all this other stuff that's going on out there. But the reality is, this is not the hottest year on record since they've been keeping accurate temperature measurements. 1936 is the record holder. And we do know that the Earth has been warmer within human history. There was the medieval warming period that resulted in food growing everywhere and the blossoming of science and art and architecture, because it was so easy to get food. You just walk out your house, there's dinner. And you had time left over to contemplate things like, why did the apple fall out of the tree? Same thing in Rome. There was a Roman warming period that coincided with the development of their culture and, unfortunately, imperial aspirations. The reality is, our world is getting cooler. I mean, they can't even get to the triple-digit temperatures to announce a heat wave. It's in the 90s. Yeah, it's summer. That's what happens. But they're still out there trying to raise on a busted flush on this whole global warming nonsense. And as we reported last week, solar scientists are concerned. There are now multiple peer-reviewed studies that were looking at the very strange behavior of this last solar cycle. It said it appears that we're heading into a prolonged lull in solar activity, a new Maunder minimum. And we already know, and this is confirmed by research at CERN, that climate on Earth is dominated by solar activity and the shape of the Earth's orbit. And all these people asking for your obedience and your money to save the Earth from climate change are fraudsters, because until they can control the sun and until they can change the shape of the Earth's orbit, we're going to go through periods of warming and cooling. And the geological and fossil record shows this has been happening all the time. Climate change is the norm. But politicians, they'll take something that happens naturally and normally, they'll promote it as a crisis, and then they'll sell you a solution. In exchange for your carbon taxes, I'll save you from global warming. Except the world isn't warming. Big hue and cry in the 1990s, the world is getting warmer, and back then it was. Then Mother Nature fooled them all, started getting cooler, and that's when they got into that hide the decline, and fudging the data, and altering the computer code to keep selling hockey stick, hockey stick, hockey stick. We've had several record-setting winters in a row. And now they're trying to take 90-degree temperatures in the Northeast and claim that that represents a scorching heat wave. When I was growing up in New Hampshire back in the 1950s, yes, I am that old. Got another birthday coming up. 90 degrees in the summer? Yeah, that was just what we got. People adapt to this stuff. When the American Revolution was being fought, we were still at the tail end of the Little Ice Age. That's why that painting of Washington crossing the Delaware shows them fending off giant blocks of ice, which you don't see now. But nobody in Washington's crew was saying, gosh darn, this little ice age, look at all this ice. It was just the world as it was. And you adapt to what's going on. The world is getting a little warmer. All right, we adapt to that. We adjust to that. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide is at a new record high, 400 parts per million. Ooh, horror right there. And they're trying to wave that around about why we must have carbon controls and carbon taxes. And meanwhile, botanists are reporting that the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is stimulating plant growth in a world that is already struggling with famine. Plants that grow faster, taller, and produce more food is a good thing. Unless, of course, you're a stockholder in Monsanto, who want all natural organic food production to vanish from the face of the earth, so you must go to them to buy your food products. That's their long-term business plan here. Over in Germany, they've had enough with all this green environmental nonsense. They're pulling the plug on solar subsidies. We've seen all across the globe all these giant wind and solar farms that are built at taxpayer expense, and they don't hold up, they're not built to last, and they don't pencil out. More about alternative energy when we come back. And aloha America, welcome back to the show. And we're talking about alternative forms of energy. And by the way, I think it's a good idea. The more you centralize energy providers, the more you become a victim of price manipulation, and these centralized sources of energy or anything become targets for terrorism. Safety and security and reliability lies best with distributed systems, small, little, tiny providers everywhere you can. The problem with the way that alternative energy has been handled politically is that most of them turn out to be quid pro quo for campaign donations, taxpayer funding of systems of questionable quality. And it turns out to be it's just another scam where somebody will make a bunch of donations to a candidate, and then they'll say, I'm in the solar power business. And they go out and buy the cheapest product they can, put it up there, get their tax subsidies and other bailouts, put it in their pocket, and then the system falls apart. Turns out to be inefficient, not able to pencil out. I think there should be development of alternative energy, but it should be run like any other business. Make sure you have something that is going to work before you sell it. Because the way we're doing it now, we're incentivizing shoddy construction, shoddy products that do not work. We have a couple of major wind farms here in the state of Hawaii. There's one down on the Big Island that was put up at huge taxpayer funding. It's already been shut down. It's corroding in the salt air. We have another wind farm they built just recently up here by Kahuku on the island of Oahu. And when the wind is blowing really hard, they have to shut it down because the turbines will not stand the stress. Plus, one of the most commonly used turbines in these wind farms turns out to not have the 25-year lifespan that was advertised. They're starting to fall apart. The company is no longer in existence, so you can't even get spare parts anymore. It was all about making a bunch of money right now, and we cannot go on incentivizing inferior quality anything in this country, whether it's wind turbines, solar cells, cars, computers, government, banking. We can't incentivize failure. When we talk about the blueprint for the new America, the guiding principle should be to incentivize excellence and to penalize failure to perform heavily. Now, for those of you listening to the show, especially on Justin TV, and you're hearing a little bit of garbling, we use Skype to connect our studio here on Oahu with our control room in Austin, Texas. And apparently, as of its last update, Skype is now going through the cloud, which, you know, if the NSA wants to know what I'm talking about on this show, they can tune into RBN here. But we noticed earlier today, actually over the weekend, we were trying to use Skype to communicate with family. You know, just say, hey, how are the kids growing, that kind of stuff. Nothing but problems. Could get the video, but no sound. A lot of complaints about that out on the World Wide Web. And here we have another situation of everybody being forced to use the cloud because it makes it easier for the government to spy on you and your conversations. And it turns out to be, you know, a poorer quality and reliability than its predecessor. And the agenda clearly here was to make sure your conversations are open to the NSA, and if it's not always working all the time, well, you know, break the connection, reconnect a couple of times, the problems will go away here. Or reinstall it. You know, we don't care if it actually doesn't work for you any longer as long as we've got you on the cloud. So at least in terms of Skype, we're now on the cloud. And I absolutely do not agree with that. And again, it goes back to the same thing I was saying about power generation, energy sources. If you're dependent on a central corporatized facility for essential services, you are then wide open to price manipulation. And I understand using the cloud now is free. It's a loss leader while they get everybody dependent on the cloud. Do you think it's going to stay free forever? I don't think so. And again, if that single data center goes down, everybody's shut off. You really should, for reasons of economy and reliability and privacy, you should keep your own data under your own control. Take responsibility for your own backups. Keep your data safe. There have been a couple of very embarrassing failures of the cloud where people have lost their MP3 collection and their family photos and so forth. Dependency is slavery even on the computers. You should not be dependent on those data centers. Even Carbonites had a couple of embarrassments. But the business model is get it all into one large structure and get everybody dependent on that and then charge them whatever we can. Whether it's computer resources, electricity, gas, oil, food. Now, more research is surfacing. This is from naturalnews.com. More research continues to surface that glyphosate, which is the weed killer in Roundup, is far more toxic than Monsanto would admit or the U.S. government acknowledged. Low levels of glyphosate, which you're going to be exposed to. And by the way, a reminder, if you're buying your vegetables from the supermarket, when you bring them home, wash them thoroughly. Probably ought to think about peeling them. Low levels of glyphosate exposure in humans can lead to conditions like Parkinson's disease, infertility, and cancer. And apparently all of this goes to a phenomenon of glyphosate which Monsanto and the U.S. government basically ignored, which is its interference with a chemical, cytochrome P450. And it disrupts normal, healthy biology. Researchers have found that glyphosate inhibits the body's ability to naturally detoxify. In other words, if you're exposed to glyphosate, your body is no longer able to get rid of other toxins that you have encountered as part of the environment. And apparently, chronic exposure to glyphosate leads to a chronic inflammation that can lead to other health impediments down the road. See, the model in the United States is very simple. Somebody comes out with a brand new product, and they'll dip a bunch of animals in it for 30 days. And if the animals don't die, it's declared safe. But we know that with a lot of these chemicals, the health consequences of exposure may not appear immediately. It may take a long time for them to show up. We know that because Monsanto's original toxicity studies for Roundup and GMO corns only lasted for 3 months. That recent French study, which is now being replicated by the Russians, showed that the ill effects in rats showed up in the 4th month and got worse from there on. And this is why Monsanto is having the NSA keep an eye on those of us who refuse to believe that GMO is a blessing on our life. By the way, apparently CDC is now acknowledging that 30 million Americans are now at greater risk of cancer from the polio vaccine. A lot of people were saying there are chemicals in the vaccines which are actually known carcinogens, and now even the CDC is having to shuffle its feet and say, well, yeah, I guess you're right. The epidemiological analysis of cancer is showing that, yeah, there's a correlation with the polio vaccine. So there, is our face red kind of a situation here. Apparently, children's ADHD prescriptions have increased 9-fold since 1997. Now remember, the guy who came up with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder shortly before he died admitted it was a created disease made up out of thin air to help the pharmaceutical companies sell these prescription mood-altering drugs, which have a long and well-documented track record of causing acts of extreme violence and suicide. But it's making money. That's all that really matters in the United States of America. And they're doping our kids with this stuff. Now, when I was a kid, we had the same symptoms in classroom of not paying attention, looking out the window. It was called teachers boring me. Because teachers spending all of his or her time with the kids that are having trouble learning, and those of us who were a little bit sharper, had a few more marbles, we're getting bored. Doesn't mean we're ill. Doesn't mean we're diseased. It means we already get it. We already understand what the teacher is trying to teach us. And there's no reason for us to keep on paying attention blindly while they repeat something we've already learned for the benefit of those who haven't got it yet. But we live in a society in which normal human behaviors are declared to be diseases in order to sell us medications we don't really need, and which in many cases are proving to be harmful. I want you all to do me a favor. And I know you've already seen these, but your homework for tonight is as you watch TV and you see the commercials coming on about the latest new drug that will cure you of some behavior, pay very careful attention to that little disclaimer that's on there. Some of them are little tiny fonts at the bottom of the screen. The others are the voice saying, use of this drug can do this and that. Actually listen to that part of the commercial. I cannot understand how any normal, rational human being can look at those commercials, hear those warnings about all the dire possible consequences of using this medication, and still go into their doctor and say, I saw this on TV, write me a prescription. And the doctor will say, sure, here's a prescription. Now, a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that came out from this institution claiming that fish oils were actually going to increase your risk of prostate cancer. Obviously a concern for us guys. And Natural News did a little research and found out this institution was wholly owned and was a PR front for the large pharmaceutical companies who don't want you maintaining your health using naturally occurring materials you can find in nature. They want you to buy their new patented synthetic molecule chemical and take that. And I'll tell you where the danger of that is. When you go out and you get something from nature, like valerian root, it's a very benign example. It's a natural tranquilizers. We human beings and those other plants and animals have co-evolved millions of years. We've gotten used to each other in the biochemical sense. These artificial chemicals coming out of these pharmaceutical labs are brand new. Our bodies really don't know how to deal with them. And that's where all these surprises are coming from. Apparently GlaxoSmithKline was caught yet again in China, engaging in widespread bribery and criminal fraud to promote its products. And there's a new one you ought to put on your list of things never to look at. We talked about this last week. And I can't even pronounce it. It looks like methyl isothiazolinone. It's called MI for short, but you ought to put that on your list of things to avoid, along with propylene glycol, formaldehyde precursors, and a bunch of others. Apparently, the use of this chemical in personal care products has triggered an epidemic of skin allergies. And people will get these skin allergies and the rashes, and they'll go to the doctor, and does the doctor tell them stop using this product? No, not based on our experience with Claire and her joint pain. The doctor will say, here's a prescription for something that'll make it better. Oh, that doesn't work. Well, here's another prescription. We'll try that. And they throw even more chemicals at you because it's all about selling product. They're not interested in your health and wellness. They can't make money off of you if you're healthy. They need you to be sick. Modern medicine destroys public health because illness and chronic symptoms are a profit opportunity. All righty. Bit of a brouhaha up in Canada where there were some posters being put up by a men's rights group talking about the epidemic of false rape allegations that is now striking Canada. And basically challenging the idea that's coming from their version of the feminists that all men are rapists. And that no means no. Well, I understand no means no, and I agree with that. But yes also has to mean yes. And the specific case that is being called to attention here is a growing phenomenon of women who go out on a Friday night and they go home with a guy and they have sex, and the next morning they wake up with morning after regrets and scream that it was rape. And it wasn't. And this is a revival of the militant feminism of the 1990s, which showcased feminists like Marilyn French, who originated that expression, all men are rapists and that's all they are. And back in the 1990s, women who claimed to be raped in spectacular ways become instant, overnight media stars. And according to the FBI supplementary crime statistics of the period, rape became the second most often falsely reported crime in the United States of America. How did the corporate media respond to that? Well, Time magazine quoted Catherine Comins, the assistant dean of student life at Vassar, saying that a false rape charge against a man wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because it would encourage him to think, am I really capable of these abuses against women? Women wore T-shirts that said potential rape victim. Even if they'd never been attacked, they wanted to get onto that bandwagon there. And false accusations soared, as women were literally being taught that a rape accusation represented empowerment. Gary Dosen spent 6 years in prison after being randomly picked for a rape accusation by Kathleen Crowell, who was trying to hide from her parents that she was in a consensual sex relation with her boyfriend. Now, after 6 years, a DNA test finally cleared Dosen. Actually, it was after 11 years. National Organization of Women fought the use of DNA tests for men accused of rape every step of the way, saying use of such tests implied women would lie about such things. It was the Davis, California rape hoax, which almost resulted in an unconstitutional males-only curfew in the city, before the victim finally admitted she just made up the whole story about being gang-raped on a highway median by skateboarding teenagers, because she wanted to go on the talk shows that were featuring this thing. And so these posters up there, they're getting a huge amount of criticism from the women's groups up there, but they're making a valid point. No means no. We all agree with that one. But yes has to mean yes. If the woman says yes, she can't have regrets afterwards and claim it was rape. And we saw that happen. William Kennedy Smith is exactly what happened. Woman went home with him, had sex with him consensually. The next morning, felt he was ignoring her and said, oh, it was rape after the fact. It's another way of trying to distract us all from economy and wars and Benghazi and the rest of it. They're trying to bring back the rape hysteria and the racial tensions. They're recycling all these old pieces of propaganda. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. We're almost done for our Monday. And I want to go back here to the Zimmerman case because there's a new story breaking. It should be obvious by now that the Department of Justice, the White House, the corporate media have been trying to fan up the George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case for its racial overtones since day one. And one area of contention has to do with NBC, which back on March 27th broadcast what was supposed to be an excerpt of George Zimmerman's phone call with the police dispatcher. And NBC edited out significant portions of the call, with the end result, the edited version, making it sound like Zimmerman was profiling Trayvon Martin for racism. What NBC broadcast was, quote, this guy looks like he's up to no good, he looks black, end quote. The actual conversation was, Zimmerman, this guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something, it's raining, he's just walking around looking about. Dispatcher, okay, and this guy, is he black, white, or Hispanic? Zimmerman, he looks black. Completely different context of that conversation. The dispatcher asked him for a racial description. And NBC took that all out to make it look like Zimmerman said, he looks like he's up to no good, he looks black. Zimmerman is now suing NBC for defamation following his acquittal. And I hope he wins. And I'm not a supporter of Zimmerman. I think he showed questionable judgment going after Trayvon after the dispatcher told him don't follow the guy any longer. But very clearly, NBC was editing the audio to sell this idea that this was all being racially motivated. And I hope George Zimmerman ends up owning NBC News. And George, if you're listening to this, you could carry the RBN shows on the NBC network. Anyway, let's see. Apparently over in New York, drivers were being pulled over by this strange guy waving his arms and flashing a badge, screaming that they were driving too slow. And it turned out to be this rabbi who was impersonating a police officer, and now he's been arrested and booked for impersonating a police officer. Like, I guess being a rabbi wasn't good enough. But he was out there screaming, "Police, police, pull over." Here's a very bizarre story. Apparently, there was this children's play center that was hosting a party for a father's child, and they called the police when he wanted to sing happy birthday to his young daughter because he hadn't paid for the party package, and so could not be allowed to sing. And they called the cops on him. Is that an appropriate reaction? Is that an appropriate use of the police department? All right, so we're almost to the end of the show here, and I basically want to wrap up. And once again, I want to thank everybody listening to the show for helping get the word out not to fall for the stunt of racial rioting following the Zimmerman verdict, because it's what the government wanted. They didn't get their riots, they didn't get their national emergency, they didn't get their martial law, didn't get a little uprising to brutally put down to deter the big uprising. Major, epic fail on the part of the propagandist, and thank you all. Congratulate yourselves. Pat yourselves on the back. We're going to be back here tomorrow at the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay skeptical, stay alert. Please support Republic Broadcasting all you can. They need all the help that you can. We're not getting big checks from Monsanto for some strange reason. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.